Hello, sorry for the late start. I was working on some B-rolls for a couple of videos that I was working on. So thank you for those who are with us so far. Chris and Emmanuel will be dropping in shortly. While I wait for the guys to come in. Hold on. Here we go. We have Chris right here.
Hello.
Hello. How are we doing, brother? How are we doing?
Oh, had a really good show with Niall and Jeff Waldorf from the Young Turks. Good day. Good day.
I'm gonna have to make sure to catch up on that. I've been behind on a lot of stuff, so I've been trying to get caught up on a couple of videos that I need to work on.
The good news is we ended up not talking about Kamala Harris a lot, so I've got that here. We ended up talking about Joe Biden more.
Well, that's good because tonight I think we need to talk about them, and we're going to talk about them in a different aspect than most people normally do. And that's the reason why, that's what's special about what we're trying to do here, and I look forward to that. And I'm gonna wait till we get Emmanuel on before I give our announcement. Which I talked to you about, which I mentioned in our chat earlier. Due to some of the things which I want to do with the show, especially, and hopefully we're able to make this all gel out perfectly, but. There's a couple of topics that I want us to be able to talk about in our space, and be able to face all kinds of truths, all kinds of doubts, conspiracies, everything. Face it all, and weigh out what we actually think instead of just automatically dismissing everything right off the bat. And this is leading up to what I want to do, as we spoke about before. I admire Chris Richards here. I admire a lot of his insight into looking back through history, and that's why I reached out to him and wanted to have him a part of the show, because I felt that he had valuable knowledge that could be really pushed out. Emmanuel also comes from. He has a couple of different things which. Speak to different things which I want to bring out in the show. Manuel has a great eye for skepticism, and I feel skepticism is very important. And hey, how you doing, Emmanuel?
Hi guys, what's up?
I was saying that Emmanuel's what I saw in him is his eye for skepticism, and I really admire that, because you need to have an eye for skepticism before you can really weigh out the complete truths of all the things. And then, of course, my aspect, which I come from, is trying to look at this from a broader, more existential political lens, and what's really kind of moving the major levers at the top, this major chessboard that's going on. The announcement that I wanted to start off the show with is we will have a new co-captain joining the team. That'll be Chris Lawson. He goes by
okay, so that's another Chris.
Yes, that's another Chris.
Okay.
So we'll have two Chris's. I'm sure that won't get too confusing after a while. Who knows? Maybe we might start using nicknames or Twitter names. Who knows? We'll figure out something. But yes, I wanted to announce Chris coming onto our show. He will be starting with us next week. He like I talked about with Chris and Emmanuel in DM, he is going to be bringing the different element, which I don't always feel as comfortable talking about, but some of the thoughts are rolling around in the back of my head, and sometimes I have conversations with some of my colleagues here about the different things between us. And so I have a brave soul who wants to talk about some of those things, those third rails, those taboos in a sense. And so Chris is going to be talking about those things. Being that this whole political matrix is all controlled, we all know, in a sense. Everybody has their different, suspicions that, oh, well, it's this billionaire or Illuminati or the Bilderbergs or whatever. In this particular show, I want to focus on the effects of Kamala Harris being the VP choice, for one. That's one aspect I want to look into. The next aspect, and how we got to Kamala Harris exactly, the deep behind the scenes motive. So I challenge Chris and Emmanuel to pull out some different point of views that most people haven't spoken about yet. Another thing I wanted to focus on is, what does that mean long term if Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are elected? What does that actually look like in actual governance? And how is that? How does that go along with what the powers that be we perceive the powers that be want, or is it a buck against those things? So just kind of laying that thought out there. I'll let hey Emmanuel, why don't you lead in? What do you think on like how this whole Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, what does this mean for the mainframe in a sense, the political matrix?
There's obviously, well, of course, we obviously have to talk about the layer of identity politics in regards to Kamala Harris, trying to use our identity politics to overlook her vastly abysmal policy record and criminal justice record.
And even trying to scam her identity politics to a certain degree, because her identity is not 100% what it's sold as.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that I feel like that's something I wanted to really touch on that. And I feel like, hey, throw caution to the wind and let's just talk about it honestly. At best, let's say, for instance, say her father is 100% African Jamaican. Let's say that. The fact that she still did not have a relationship with her father should be weighed in. And even if she did have a relationship with her father, that's a relationship with a Jamaican Black. That's a different relationship than the American Black experience. And I feel like to come in and try to, even if you had that, to try to pretend that you had the American Black experience. And on top of it, your parents were wealthier and you went to a lot of nice schools and fancy stuff, to try to scapegoat that image just because you went to a predominantly Black school and you joined a sorority or something. I have big problems with that, and it's really frustrating to see that that's not called out a lot more. I mean, a lot of the Black elite, I guess we'll say, in CBC, and a lot of these people are just saying, hey, shh, just keep this quiet. It doesn't matter. We get a person of color, even if you have like 5% Black, good enough.
What's the old saying? A seat at the table. You've got people who have traded loyalty to the ruling class for a seat at the table.
And I mean, this is something that I'm working on my video still, which I talked about it on a previous show, but I'm still working on the video about Bill Clinton and his comments about Stokely Carmichael, other known as Kwame Ture, and how I perceive this. Like, just in a short nutshell, instead of getting into the deepness I'm going to go into in the video, it breaks down to, this is how you're supposed to act, and that's how you're not supposed to act. And anytime somebody who is in a dominant position is telling a minority group, this is how you need to behave, I don't know how. I mean, honestly, if it was me and most of the people I know sitting in that audience, it would have been a much different response and a lot of cheers and applause. I'm just saying that.
Well, and he phrased it as a compliment to Lewis and as a criticism of militancy in general.
Mm-hmm.
it's not out of bounds to look at it as a criticism of what's happening now. Stokely would definitely approve what's happening now.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I feel what's going on is because Stokely and a lot of those guys were not allowed to be able to really push their message to the masses. They were able to be silenced early or pushed aside or ridiculed. And so that took away the credibility of their message unfairly, in my opinion. But it still did. So with that said, I feel like now people are finally starting to catch up to what he was talking about. I'm sorry, you hear a little bit of a
Yeah, it's echoing some.
A little bit.
How about that? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Now that seems to have taken out our echo.
Hold on a second.
Mostly.
Right.
How's that?
Hello?
Hello? Still echoing a
Did
little.
that help?
Yeah, I'm still echoing.
Well, darn it.
Am I? No, it's still echoing.
It's definitely happening to both of us. Or did it just stop?
Did
When
it
Mark
stop?
muted, it stopped.
How about I mute it whenever you're talking?
That works.
Oh, Chris, did you want to finish what you're about to say?
Oh, what was I saying? Sorry. There's a tendency to always want to tell people the mythological version of the civil rights movement. And the mythology is important to people. It's important that people believe certain things about Martin Luther King and certain other things about Malcolm X and certain different things completely about Kwame Ture. And all these myths are very different from the reality. And people don't want to accept how radical a lot of the ideas were. And there's a rejection of what, it's ironic, really, because when Bill Clinton talks about things going John Lewis's way instead of Stokely's way, that's wrong. What actually happened is that Stokely's way led to people like John Lewis becoming established political figures in these entrenched black districts that couldn't be taken away from them. And those leaders then used that organizing that Stokely had done to put them into that position to join the ruling class instead of continuing to work against it for their people once they were elected.
I mean, perfectly said. I mean, Emmanuel, you kind of grew up in one of those districts where you have one of those similar types of politicians around, for decades, close to you, who was that same type of mold where he used a lot of his fame and prestige from the civil rights movement. And then because it was safer for him, chose to sit comfortably in the seat and chose to instead say, we will push for the equality stuff and we will ignore all the economic ills that have went on. I mean, everybody already knows the history of slavery and Jim Crow and all the things that went on through civil rights and redlining and all these things that led up. And you can't just think that, okay, we'll do a little bit of desegregation and that's going to solve the problem. I mean,
even to solve racial problems, you still got to take money away from rich white people to give it to poor black people.
That's right.
Well, that's a dirty little secret. That's what nobody really wants to admit. And here's the crazy thing. In actuality, it's not even most white people that you would have to take the money from. The problem is the white people who you would have to take it from do not want to admit that. So what they do is they pass off the blame as if, oh no, man, they're going to go after you, they're going to go after you. But really, they know it's them. And so if they can always deflect the blame and make you feel their pain and make you march out in the streets for them, like a lot of the people on the right typically do for a lot of these, the top 1%. And the thing about it is most of the 1%, which we really complain about, are really, they're still puppets to a 1% above that. I mean, even if that's a 1%, I don't even know what
the 0.001% or 0.01% or whatever.
Yeah, those are the people who are really pushing these things. And the thing about it is many of them have been bold enough to outright say it. I won't say the person's name, but I'll let you guys figure out who I'm talking about. He said he cares not which puppet sits on the throne. Cares not, because he who has the money will decide the rules.
That could be a few different people.
Oh yeah. So I left it. Well, I misquoted it a little bit to leave it a little vague. But the person. But if you look at it, they're telling you a lot of the things and how these things work and how they've been set up, even in entertainment things which we watch. For instance, I'm a fan of Game of Thrones. I don't know if you guys are also. But those in the audience who are Game of Thrones fans, you guys are definitely going to be familiar with the Iron Bank. The Iron Bank was how every single war, every single decision on who was going to be, the ruler of which kingdom was all ordained by the Iron Bank. And it's no different, which we have many Iron Banks all stationed around the world, which we call Federal Reserves. These organizations which fund governments, which are unaccountable to any government, which are not able to be audited ever. These are the people which decide. I mean, there's actual accounts of the War of 1812, which it was funded literally on both sides of one bank was funding both sides of the war, and they had literally enough money to make that work. I mean, and so we need to be aware of some of these things which may seem like this is one thing. It might be something completely different than what we perceive.
So here's another example of the exact same thing. In World War I, because of international patent law, there was only one company in the entire world, Krupp in Germany, that made time-delayed artillery shells. They were the only people who made artillery shells with time-delayed fuses in the world, which meant the British, the French, the Austrians, the Russians, the Germans, the Italians, in the end of the war, the Americans, everybody in World War I was buying their artillery shells from the same company. So imagine how rich that company got off all the artillery shells fired in World War
I. Or better yet, that family, which got rich. Because if you really dig back far enough into history, every one of these corporations all start off as a family business. It all starts off, small in the beginning a lot of times. And the only difference between these corporations, which are these massive conglomerates, which we know today, is they just were able to grow and grow and grow over a much longer period of time.
Families in the news. Let's take names from recent headlines. You remember the scandal in with the UK where Donald Trump's ambassador to the Court of St. James said, "Can we move the British Open to Donald Trump's country club?" And So that ambassador is Robert Wood Johnson IV. Now, what most people know is that Robert Wood Johnson IV is Woody Johnson, who's the owner of the New York Jets. But he's
Okay.
Robert Wood Johnson IV. That means there was a first and a second and a third. Well, who was Robert Wood Johnson I? Well, he was one of the Johnson brothers, Johnson and Johnson. You may have heard of them. So Robert Wood Johnson IV is the inheritor, not of the company. He has nothing to do with the company anymore, but of the money generated from taking that company public. The Manson murders in Southern California, everybody remembers Sharon Tate.
Yeah.
But the other person who was killed was Abigail Folger, who was the heir not to the company, but to the Folger coffee fortune, the money made from taking Folgers public.
That I did not know. That
You
is
didn't know about
very-
Abigail Folger?
I mean, I knew the name, but I did not connect.
She
Well,
was
I
a
knew the
coffee
name. I
heir.
knew there was somebody else, but I didn't know the
I
connection.
did not make the connection at
She-
all.
The heir to the money from taking Folgers public.
Well, it's just like something interesting, which I guess I connected it years ago and then forgot about it, and then it came back around. And on Twitter just the other day, somebody was tweeting about it, and they said, you know that the one of the Astors, the heads of the Astor family, who like helped fund and build the Titanic, who died on the Titanic,
John
was-
Jacob.
was a big opponent of the Federal Reserve being established for the United States. Him and a couple of other billionaires who were aboard that ship, which was supposed to be the ship which was
That was before
able
the
to be
Federal
destroyed.
Reserve. though.
well. That's the
Basically,
thing. They were. I mean, the theory.
There wasn't really a talk of a Federal Reserve back then.
Well, they didn't have an actual name for it, but because you got to remember before they had the two times where they got the charter basically to loan for a period of time to the United States, and they wanted to push for it again. I believe it was it J.P. Morgan? It might have been J.P. Morgan at the time, or I might be mistaken, but I'll go back and research if I'm wrong. But I believe it was James Pierpont Morgan at the time who was making most of the negotiations with the government, trying to get that passed.
Well, yeah, because banking history is interesting, and it's worth
Yeah, like the
talking about maybe
Warbirds
for a show on its own. But first, you had the Bank of the United States from Alexander Hamilton. And the first Bank of the United States was a government bank. It was run with a certain degree of independence by private bankers, but in the end, it was a government bank. And the purpose was to allow the government to set interest rates, not to allow private bankers to set interest rates. The Bank of the United States was very unpopular with private banks who saw it as competition. So when Jefferson came into office, Jefferson killed the first Bank of the United States. But Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury said, "You idiot, we need to control the interest rates or these banks are going to run out of control. I know you hate banks, but by killing the Bank of the United States, you've killed the only thing keeping the other banks in check. We have to bring it back." And so that's the second Bank of the United States. And then Andrew Jackson killed that. Andrew Jackson killed the second Bank of the United States, and he took all of the Federal Reserve cash and spread it out between some 20 or 30 or 40 private banks all over the country that were called his pet banks. And that system of private banking prevailed until the Federal Reserve Act passed. There wasn't a Bank of the United States after that.
And that's the reason why, like,
That's why
one of the
JP Morgan was so rich. That's why the Federal Reserve Act was so important at the time. It was supposed to be, in theory, taking control of all that, though in the end it abdicated of Congress's responsibility back to the private bankers.
Mhm. And that's what I wanted to bring around to, who really controls all of this stuff, because it's a much bigger question than we can really answer right here in a couple of sound bites. But
it's actually very small and easy.
Well, yeah, the banks.
Who are the bank's customers control all that. And who are the bank's customers? The bank's customers are billionaires. The billionaire, there are a group of however many people, I can't remember the US numbers right now, who sit on all the boards of all the big corporations because they own the majority of the stock. And this small group of people owns the majority of stock in all the big corporations. They sit on all the boards. They know each other. They're not necessarily in the majority of all the boards, but they're on them. Mm-hmm. They make money off of everything.
I'll say the number that I heard from a top level high end banker who was trying to like come out of it, and he disclosed some other things which get a little off the wall, which I'll disclose in like another video. But he said that it's roughly about 8,500 to roughly 10,000, high level bankers and CEOs and people who are really making all the power moves. And when they have these meetings, whatever they want to call it, most people focus on the Bilderbergs or they focus on the Freemasons. But what you need to focus on is look at all these different charity groups and foundations. What they've done is they've expanded to so many different names within shell companies. And they don't have to sit down on a board at, some fancy place at a specific place to have these arrangements. Sometimes they just go out on their yachts out to Bora Bora or something and all talk about this through satellite phone calls. I mean, they don't all, in this day and age, they especially don't have to all be in the same place to even discuss these things.
Well, and that's the most important part of it. There are things that don't need to be discussed because they just benefit everyone. I mean, let's talk about the Republican tax cut the first year Trump was in office. It wasn't something that Donald Trump had to talk to the Republicans about. It wasn't something that the Republicans had to be talk to Donald Trump about. Everybody wanted this to happen. The Republicans had drawn this up when Obama was president, but knew he wouldn't sign it. And so as soon as there was a Republican president, they pulled it out and passed it, and the Republican president signed it. They didn't. Nothing else had to happen.
Like the post office, they're trying to blame the privatization of the post office on Donald Trump, but in reality, Republicans have been trying to do that for a really long time.
Not just Republicans.
Democrats have like 7 different times to actually stop it, and they never did.
Dr. Jason Johnson. Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah.
Dr. Jason Johnson put his foot in it yesterday. He couldn't resist trying to take one last shot at Bernie. And he tried to say it's Bernie's fault that Donald Trump is able to do so much damage to the post office now because he blocked Obama's appointees and the postal board wasn't full. And Donald Trump was able to completely fill the postal board because Bernie blocked Donald Trump's appointees. So I was talking to a Democrat earlier today, not just any Democrat, an Obama fan.
Oh, yeah.
And the Obama fan said, wait, no. I mean, how does this mean Obama wanted to privatize the post office? And because I said, so basically what Dr. Johnson just said is Obama tried to privatize the post office and Bernie stopped him. Mm-hmm. And so the Obama person, well, where do you get that? And somebody else explained, and he was like, Yeah, but even then, how do we know that this was really Obama trying to privatize it? And this person said something again and named some specific names. And then the Obama person looked that person up and said, oh my gosh, I looked at who this person actually was. He wrote in 1988, he wrote this shit for the Cato Institute about privatizing the post office. Why was Bernie the only person trying to stop his appointment? And this was the Obama person saying it. So he,
Wow.
if you actually look at the facts and you're actually open to the facts, it completely turns around your thinking.
Wait, Chris, wasn't it Warren Gunnels who
Warren Gunnels showed receipts,
who put Jason Johnson in place about
and he's saying, yeah, these people were all pro privatization, and that's why Bernie stopped them. Bernie stopped Obama from privatizing the post office. Trump is just trying the same thing as Obama, and I think what Jason Johnson did may have done more to pull the wool off the eyes of Democrats than anything that Bernie people have done for the last few years.
Well, something that I've been looking at that I think is happening. Hold on a second. Give me a problem again. All right, hopefully that's better. It seems like when I mute myself, echoing goes away. Nope, it's back.
Well, I don't hear it.
All right, maybe it's just me. I'll try to go through it and say what I was going to say.
I hear it too, and I echo when Marcus echoes. I don't know why it only affects me and not you, because I don't hear Emmanuel echo.
Right.
Let's say go on ahead for a minute until I try to fix this. Go ahead.
Sure. So, what do you think of Kamala Harris being the vice president? I mean, what's the real? I mean, you really look at her position, and what's the difference between her and Biden? How is she balancing the ticket?
I honestly really don't. It kind of feels like 4 years ago, and I'm just kind of like a little bit done. I mean, I'm just looking at it right now, and just people are like, oh, she's the first woman, she'll be black. They were comparing Biden to FDR, and now they tried to compare Kamala to Truman, and I'm like, what are you doing?
Now that's a good comparison.
Why do that? Why?
And I'll tell you why.
Why?
I'll tell you why Kamala is a good comparison for Truman. Because Truman was put on the ticket in 1944 because FDR's vice president was a socialist. An ex-Republican socialist, which just makes it even funnier. But FDR's vice president, his second of three, was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace had been Secretary of Agriculture and under Hoover of all people, and stayed Secretary of Agriculture under FDR because he was the only person in Hoover's cabinet who was doing anything successfully about the Depression. And then he got promoted to vice president. I think there was another cabinet position somewhere first, maybe. I don't remember if he went straight from agriculture to VP or whether there was something else. But he was FDR's second vice president. And was vice president for a long time, was instrumental in bringing Russia into the war with the U.S. and Great Britain as an ally, as opposed to just someone who was also fighting the Germans. Mm-hmm. He was someone who was closely involved in communications between the U.S. government and the Russians during World War II, and was very important in establishing what relationships were established during the war. As a result, he was accused of being pro-Russia, and they wanted to get him off the ticket in 1944 and replace him with Truman, who was someone who was more willing to push the military industrial complex's line on being anti-communist.
There you go.
And so
Well, I guess
Harris is
that
a
makes
good
sense.
comparison with Truman.
I guess well, I guess if you look back to Truman, yeah, from that aspect, if you look at his foreign policy, definitely, there's definitely that same correlation. I guess because growing up in that area where Truman is considered so great, and not that I ever really did, I always gave him a lot of credit for integrating the military.
Yes, there are two things you have to give Truman credit for.
Right, I'll give him Truman credit.
First, and this is not. We give Johnson credit for Medicare, which is legit, but Truman expanded Social Security to a lot of people who were not getting it before under the original rules under Roosevelt. And he essentially created, even though it wasn't Medicaid yet, he essentially created the idea of the federal government paying for health care for the poor. He tried to get universal health care and didn't get it, but he got what he wanted, which was expanding Social Security some and some basic health care stuff provided by the government. Integrating the military was important because Truman was the military-industrial complex's guy. And the military-industrial complex had to adapt to the New World Order, which was the Cold War, which was very much of the military-industrial complex's deliberate making, because they needed to have an enemy to sell guns.
You see, you said something there, a phrase, which I'm going to have to ask this question. You said New World Order in there,
Yep.
and I'm just wondering, how do you think this election plays out? Like saying that there's a New World Order, and let's say that you're a fly on the wall to pick out which way that they would actually want this thing to play out. Because they benefit either way, in my opinion, the way I've assessed this. But
right, I don't think
which way
I don't
would
think
they
it's gonna
really
count.
want this to go? Which way do they get the most bang for their buck?
Well, so that depends on whether you're talking short term or long term, and that's the handicap of American capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
The American capitalist says, just like the economist John Maynard Keynes, sorry, in the long run, we're dead. And they don't really think about what's going to happen in the long run, because in the long run, we're dead. And that's very, very damaging to the people who come after them. It's one of the reasons that my parents became poorer over the course of my life.
Mm-hmm. And thank you so much for Chris. Thank you so much for explaining the that Truman was a socialist, because it explains the big Kamala
Truman
Harris
wasn't.
put.
Henry Wallace was a socialist.
Henry Wallace,
Truman was
okay.
the anti-socialist that the military-industrial complex preferred to that crazy peace guy Wallace. Because that's the whole thing. If Wallace had stayed vice president, and if Wallace had become president instead of FDR, history would have been remarkably different. We would probably not have dropped the A-bomb. That was a decision made by Truman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We would probably
Okay,
not have had the Cold War, which was a series of decisions made by Truman in response to political pressure from the military and the leaders of industry who provided the military with their toys.
Cool.
I
thought that would would explain the big progressive push that they're pressing on Kamala Harris right now. I was like, that's okay.
Well, yeah, so they want to make Truman into a progressive hero that he wasn't. That's
Right.
the first part. And then the second is like Truman, they want to make Kamala into a progressive hero that she isn't.
There it is. Okay, cool. So he wasn't actually a progressive, but they want to make him look okay.
What he is, what he would have been in today's day, is exactly what they kind of are, a neoliberal. He's going to do some good things here and there, but when you really look into the record, there's a lot of dirt under the rug.
The historical framework of the Cold War is important. I don't know how old you guys are exactly. I'm 40.
I'm almost 40, so
when I was a kid, Sting wrote a song called "If the Russians Love Their Children Too," which explains the fear of nuclear warfare still as a real thing. When I was a kid in the 1980s, 6 or 7 or 8, we were still worried about the Russians and the U.S. shooting missiles at each other. It was still a thing. It was still a thing until Bush was president, late 80s, early 90s, when we really saw all the peace stuff happening. And all of a sudden, then the Soviet Union fell apart and went away and broke up.
Mm-hmm.
And you really have to think that while the Cold War was going on, there was pressure to prove that the capitalist way of life was better than the communist way of life, which meant there was pressure to take care of poor people. People like Truman and Lyndon Johnson were pushed more than anything else to prove that capitalism could take care of the working class the same way that communism could take care of the working class. And because they felt the pressure of the Cold War, they felt that something had to be done. The less our leaders felt the pressure of the Cold War, the less they felt that certain things had to be given to the American people.
Gotcha.
And see, what I want to fill in is, I feel like this is one aspect most of us don't look at, because there's always one battle, and then there's another battle, and then a lot of times there's another battle which is going on, which is not focused on nearly as much so. And I started thinking, when going back, especially doing, looking back and through the Monroe Doctrine and the early starts of it and its advancement over the decades, how it's morphed into what it's become through the military industrial complex and all those things like that, private industry, the works. And what I've realized is the biggest push against these governments, I think more so, well, communism, socialism was a factor in it. But another factor is, if those nations decided to stay communist or socialist, it would also advocate for sovereignty more and will push against any of the Western countries coming in wanting to reap those resources. And I feel that aspect of them knowing that those countries adopting those different ideologies would push them out.
At its base, what is the Monroe Doctrine? Just in case our viewers don't know. At its base, what is the Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah, you like for me to lay it out? Okay. The Monroe Doctrine, in a sense, was created basically by our fifth president, James Monroe. Monroe, what he started to do is he started to notice with the corporations and things that were going on down into South America. I believe it was, I'm blanking on the country right now, but I know Brazil was involved and a couple of other countries.
Everybody
was the central part, mainly the central part of South America. And I'm talking about the Banana Wars.
Gran Colombia, which was modern Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, and Ecuador, which was
that's what I'm trying
Gran
to remember.
Colombia under Simon Bolivar.
yes, that group of countries there were the target, which our government decided to first go in and start kicking around, to see what kind of resources that we can get. And then when we notice, oh, wait a minute, we can influence some of the leaders down here, and some of these leaders we can just push right off the block, and nobody will even complain about it. And then the other Western nations start getting involved too, and they're like, hey, well, especially our good buddy Great Britain. Great Britain was always ready to, get in any kind of thievery that we were into.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever became the hot new thing, whatever hot resource, if it was bananas was a time period, salt became one. Of course, we know about gold. Of course, we know about oil. And then the one which is kind of going on right now, which isn't talked about nearly as much, is lithium. So there's always a resource which they're chasing. I mean, almost like modern day pirates. And a lot of people think about like the conquistadors and, back to Columbus and all those days and chasing new lands. Well, now they know where all the lands are. It's just the thing that's new now is where the new resource is at. Exactly. What's the new hot resource? And they're still colonizing and chasing the same way that they did before.
Well, earliest European history is a bunch of white people genociding and colonizing each other. Once some sort of European hegemony was established, where they were directly conflicting with each other less in Europe, they started turning that colonizing and genociding energy against people who weren't white. But the original inhabitants of the British Isles were almost completely wiped out by the Celts and the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And the Celts were significantly displaced and culturally genocided by the Anglo-Saxons. And the Anglo-Saxons were then invaded and colonized by the Normans. And ultimately, the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons combined into this new culture called English. And so the whole history of Europe, even before there were people who weren't white in the mix, is incredibly racist and supremacist. The hatred between the English and the French was they looked at each other as different kinds of human beings, fit only to be conquered and ruled by and subjugated and all this.
Well, yeah, in the same way, if you look at between those early Anglo-Saxons and the English, the way they treated the Celts and the Scots, and then you look at the same way which the Germanic tribes were treated by the Romans later on.
And the way that the Germanic tribes treated the Romans after the empire fell, let's not forget that turnaround was fair play.
Yeah, turnaround was definitely fair play. And I'm one of those people. I feel like, hey, you did wrong to people. I don't feel too much sympathy for what happens to you in the end. So, but this is what history has been based on, and the reason why I wanted to focus on that, and especially, I know we kind of went a little bit off the rails, a little bit deep into history, but all of this all ties into modern day and the presidential election, because those same people have passed on, whether it's they've stayed in royal bloodlines where we know of whichever duchess of whatever, or whether they are kind of more a secret bloodline, whereas they were right next to, say, Alexander the Great, or they were right next to, Henry VIII or something like that. And they were able to inherit great power, wealth, influence by just being in the shadows.
It goes back further than that. The ruling families of both Thebes and Sparta claimed to be the Heracleids, which meant they were descended from Hercules, or so they told everyone.
Okay.
Well, see, I've heard an interesting different theory, and because I'm always going back and forth between historical and different ancient history from the different areas. I've also heard that two different sources, like the Flavians also, is a letter about the Flavians, where they believed that they were actually from the tribe of Dan, the Jewish, from one of the tribes of
It's
Israel.
all well. They had a relationship with a Jewish historian named Josephus,
Mm-hmm.
and
Flavius
Josephus was well. Let's use the modern framework. Josephus was successfully colonized. He was someone who wanted the Jewish people to choose to assimilate into Roman society and to choose to join the Roman Republic and to stay Jewish, but to be more Roman than Jewish. And and as a result, he went to a great deal of effort to create genealogies that would tie the Flavians, who were the Romans he worked for, to Jews, to bring Jews into the Roman Empire as feeling that the Romans were not Gentiles, because that would be the big bar. There were laws against mixing with Gentiles. Gentiles could join the Jews, but Jews weren't supposed to join the Gentiles. And so Josephus was trying to create this elaborate reason that the Jews could be Roman and the Romans weren't actually Gentiles.
Woo. I have to give you a round of applause there, because I didn't realize before I set that up that I kind of gave you a topic that was full of landmines, and you found a very eloquent way to navigate a lot of those landmines. Some people might not know exactly what I'm talking about, but just you know what I'm talking about. This, but anyway, and the reason why I think it's important for us to definitely know about Flavius Josephus is because he was an actual historical figure in person.
He was an actual historian
also. And though I know a lot of
and he wrote propaganda, it's important to understand that all the Roman imperial historians wrote what the emperors told them to write after a certain point in history.
Mm-hmm.
Before a certain point in history, they're writing what they wanted to write, but with an eye towards making the emperor happy with them while writing it. Whereas after that certain point in history, it started being, no, we're writing what the emperor wants us to write.
Chris, do you know why that is?
Yes.
I feel like that is because of Josephus Flavius. I
believe it's not because of Josephus personally.
He started that. He was one of the biggest ones to start that trend.
Well, he started doing it. He was writing that style of history for the Flavians, definitely. Mm-hmm. However, Livy was writing that same style of history for Augustus. So it's not where it started. Josephus made it more international.
Oh yeah.
He was trying to create a unified Roman identity that would also that would enable Jews to assimilate. He believed that the Romans Roman cultural toleration was good for the Jews.
Hold on 1 second. Don't forget that. Just hold that thought. I wanted to say congratulations. We just got a new subscriber. Thank you, Chris. But I wanted to put that in there. We got a new subscriber. So
okay.
All right.
Thank you, Kelly.
But please finish, because I was enjoying that.
So basically, what you've got is Livy deliberately wrote to make Augustus happy. Now, he didn't write what Augustus told him to write,
mm-hmm.
but he deliberately wrote to make Augustus happy. He had he created a very specific image of Augustus's life that was warts and all in some ways, but was also very ultimately heroic for Augustus and made Augustus the father of the country in a very George Washington sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
And Josephus was doing the same thing, but his intent was to make the Flavians the natural ruler of the whole empire, as opposed to just the city of Rome, the way Livy was working on it. Because Josephus, of course, not being Roman by birth, wanted to expand Romanness and expand Jewishness at the same time. And so now after Josephus, you have a very different attitude towards Rome in Jerusalem, and the attitude changes. They did not go Josephus's route. And then you had a situation where you had a great deal of disorder. Domitian was murdered. There were attempts to establish a new emperor that did not work out very well. And ultimately, they trotted out this doddering old senator named Nerva, who had been around since Claudius's day or before. He was an old guy. He had lived through all the emperors before. And his main strength was that he had never offended anyone, which was a big deal. And he had survived by never offending anyone. So because he had never offended anyone and was old and wasn't going to live long, well, let's put him in charge. And we'll postpone everything until later. But he was a smart guy.
Oh.
And he, even though he wasn't a very forceful emperor, he established a system where rather than just having his own kid, he chose a successor and then adopted them as his kid. And that heir did the same thing, and so on. And it was through this system of choosing a competent successor and adopting them, as opposed to giving it to a birth child, you had a much better chance at perpetuating the empire. Because instead of doing it by heredity, which Donald Trump is proof that children are not their parents, folks. His father was evil but competent, and Donald Trump is neither. Is not competent. He's just as evil but not competent. The Kennedys are another great example that kids and grandkids are not their parents.
Yeah, very good example.
Their grandparents.
Absolutely.
Joe Kennedy III is no JFK or Bobby or Teddy.
But he wants to be JFK so bad.
It's the same. It's the same with the Rockefellers. They're not their grandfather, great grandfather.
Well, no, they're not. But they're trying to do things much the same way as their grandfather.
Right. They see them.
Joe
they see their legacy.
Probably not ever going to get shot because he's definitely representing the interests of the people.
Oh yeah, he's playing ball now. Oh, yeah. Hold on a second. We're carrying signs. I wanted to read one of his comments because I thought it was pretty funny. He said Monty Python's The Life of Brian gives great perspective about the Jews/Romans during Jeb's time. Also, pretty funny rips on religion, government, and occupation/colonization, which is very true. So I wanted to put that out there for those people who had not taken the time to watch Monty Python. It's a classic. It's hilarious. So yes, if you haven't watched it, please go on ahead and watch it.
But they were able to perpetuate the empire through adoption as opposed to finding the closest blood relative, which is pretty much what they had tried to do before. The big succession problem was that Augustus didn't have sons, and all his attempts to adopt a member of his family as an heir ended with the heir dying until relatively late in his reign, where he adopted his stepson Tiberius and made him his heir. And at one point, Tiberius took over the government so as to be ready to be emperor when Augustus died, because Augustus was ailing, and that became sort of a thing. But Tiberius gave it to his great nephew Caligula, because over his own son who died. Caligula was killed by his Praetorian Guard. There's a great deal of controversy about Caligula's reign.
Yeah, a lot.
Caligula, Claudius, and Nero were all deliberately made to look bad by historians like Josephus, because it was important that the Julio-Claudians not be too legitimate after Augustus. in order to solidify the Flavians, which were a typical father to son. Vespasian gave his throne to his son Titus. Titus died young, and it was inherited by his brother Domitian. So the
I'll give you
imperial dynasty, like we would expect.
I want to give you a couple of like firsthand like accounts, what Flavius wrote, literally about them. Now, this was his writings, which is recorded as factual, history.
Mhm.
That Nero actually stomped his pregnant wife, to death on the stomach of the baby, intentionally killing her and the baby. And then he had a male servant, a young boy, which he made dress in her clothing. Also, completely, what's the word? He turned him into a eunuch. Took everything.
There was everything.
And he supposedly molested him and had a ceremony where he made him his wife. And then that's when I guess they say, well, everybody decided to attack him and it got too out of control. But that's the thing. We don't know how accurate that story is.
And that's what I'm talking about. A lot of stuff. We don't know how much of the bad stuff about Caligula and Nero and Claudius is legit bad stuff. And how much of it is just attempts to piss on them.
The city and stuff like that. And, that he crucified that he crucified most of the Christians because he blamed the fire of Rome on them.
One of the things that it's important to remember is that the reason the ordinary Romans were willing to let all this imperial strife happen is a lot of it didn't affect them very much.
Mm-hmm.
The nobles killed each other, but the ordinary Romans had their bread in circuses. And the Roman government at that point in time was much better at providing its bread and circuses than our government is proven to be now.
Yeah.
And it was the Roman success at providing the bread and circuses that sustained the Roman system. When that ability to provide the bread and circuses broke down, that's when the empire started to fall apart.
They even said that
when things started to hurt the common people too, you couldn't maintain your power.
And see, that's the thing you got to wonder, how much of that was it really breaking down, and are there manipulations from the inside? Because they even record on their own that Nero's first 5 years were literally the greatest run years.
Well, so the thing about that history was written by people who were sucking on Nero. So that's the danger. It's just as much the other way. Do you believe the pro-Nero guys or do you believe the anti-Nero guys? Now, the anti-Nero guys tried to say that Nero's mother and his second in command, Seneca, kept him on the straight and narrow, and when he killed them, then he went out of control and started going after everyone else. And so the official story was, okay, we'll legitimize the pro-Nero version of those first 5 years, and then we're going to completely trash everything after that. And Flavius Josephus was deliberately trashing everything after that. He was giving credit to the pro-Nero version of the first 5 years in order to make the bad stuff even worse.
That's the reason why I think he's such a pivotal person. I mean, I kind of wanted to bring him up on a different topic, but he's been brought up, so he's going to be talked about. But his impact, especially on forming, I mean, a lot of people don't realize it, but this one man had so much impact on the world we live in today because of his writings and what he influenced through religion, through pushing religion through the different royal bloodlines and aspects. And whether you are a religious person or believer in it or not, the one thing you do have to understand and believe is that the royals do believe in religion, and they believe in all of these things which Flavius and these people were talking about. And so everything that we see within our world that's moving in different ways is all pushed through people who have certain viewpoints. And so we don't have to adopt their viewpoints, but we need to at least understand their viewpoints.
Exactly.
Because that's the only way we're going to understand what they're trying to do.
Flavius
to us and
was
with us,
official court historian of the emperors. That's the way you have to look at it. He was the adopted brother, essentially, of the emperors. The reason that it's not exactly that straightforward, but the reason his name was Flavius is because he became a citizen by the gift of the emperor's son Titus. And when the emperor's son Titus made him a citizen, that to a certain degree made him the unofficial son of Titus, which is why his name was Flavius.
Mm-hmm. He intentionally. Now, there's a very interesting story on even how he got to the point to be able to get in that situation, because I mean, he was fighting on the other side. And
so
there was a bunch of things that
he says
to get to this point, which
all the other commanders except me killed themselves, but I didn't want to die, so I joined the enemy.
Well, they actually have a math problem which they created from him, and it's called I can't remember. It's like the Flavius puzzle or something like that, and it's a way where you sit because I guess because of the religion of Jewish people, you're not supposed to kill yourself. It'd be a sin against God, and so what they worked out is that they didn't want to surrender themselves. So what they would do is they would all kill each other. Yes. And so by the way they were all sitting, they would stab each other to the right or to the left in certain ways where it would kill each person. But what happened is Flavius actually sat there and calculated where was the part where it needed to start for him to be safe. Yes. And when it got down to the end, he completely was like, all right, boom, you're dead. And then it's like, hey, I'm not going to kill myself now. Hey, can I join you guys?
But he really says it that simply. I didn't want to die, so I joined the enemy. Now, that tells you something. I'm against war, and I don't think we should have enemies. But it tells you about a person's frame of mind for them to say that bluntly. I didn't want to die, so I joined the enemy.
Kelly has a great comment that I want to share. It says, so who is Kamala of the Roman times? Agrippa, or is that Dr. Jill Biden? LOL.
Well, let's see. They didn't really have vice presidents.
If I had to say,
Nerva would be Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
Nerva's adopted son was Antonius Pius. Antonius is how we say it these days in English, but Antonius would be how the Romans said it. But Antoninus Pius was the adopted father of Trajan, who's very famous. But they started to formulate the idea of writing what people were told to write, which is funny because they were considered the very Republican emperors who did everything in civilized ways and consulted the Senate. But they also controlled media consumption, is the best way to put it. What people knew at the time was what they read. And so the Antonines very carefully controlled what was written.
Well, a lot of people don't factor in another thing about media in general. To the higher ups and powerful, going all the way back through ancient times, media in general, or communication, or that writing down of information at that time was considered almost sacred to some people. And now a lot of us just focus on Christians, Jews, Arabs, but we don't focus on people like Druids or Jesuits or some of these different religious dogmas. And when you start getting into some of that and you start weaving those, okay, this is what this person believed into the historical records, you start getting a little bit more clearer picture of some of the things that I feel that are going on. And I feel if we don't look at some of those things, I feel we are missing massive things. Like the reason why I feel it's important for us to talk about those things is a lot of times when we focus on these Roman times, we focus on the leaders. I like to focus on the person standing next to the leaders because most of the time, that's the person who knows everything. When that leader goes down, they're the person who assumes power, or they take all the secrets with them, or normally the cash or all. And one thing which I found that was massively interesting was the Flavians for being so powerful of a name. Literally, that's the only historical figure, I mean, family dynasty that I've ever heard of that was that big that poof, poof. There's no record of what really happened.
Gone.
They're just gone. There's no okay. Well, this is
Just
the
a
last
little bit of what Josephus wrote. Yeah.
They
Well,
just poof. Die. They're
But
gone.
you have to remember that with there, you get into this huge problem of trash record keeping during what the early Middle Ages, what they used to call the Dark Ages, where the only people who were saving anything were these monks in these little abbeys. Now, why were the monks doing it? This is what's hilarious. The monks were not saving this stuff because of the importance of saving this stuff. The monks were doing it because of the importance of work. And copying this stuff down was work. And by working, they were fulfilling their monastic vows.
Mm-hmm.
So all the stuff that was saved was stuff that was copied over because of where it was sitting in the pile before the monastery got sacked by the Vikings. And so the stuff that we don't have is stuff that disappeared because the monastery got sacked by the Vikings before it got copied.
And then you got to remember that there are certain things which they don't want known also. Like I won't go into because I honestly believe
But that's the
family,
thing.
I believe
They
that
didn't
family
want
is still alive.
Any of this
and
stuff
well.
known.
I
They
believe
didn't
that
want
family is alive and well and very powerful. And we probably all know them and don't realize we know them. I'm not saying that I have it down to a specific person who I have in mind or a family group, but I have to in my theory. I just believe that they didn't just drift away. They just changed names. Like for instance, I know of many of powerful families which have changed their names.
They weren't
repeatedly.
a very big family. The thing to remember is that there wasn't a noble Flavian family in Rome before Vespasian. Vespasian was what they called a new man. He was a Spanish country squire would be the way we would look at it in a more European American sense. He was a rich guy from the provinces who went to Rome who joined the army and had a political career because of his advancement in the army. And who was chosen as emperor because he was competent at a time when they needed competence, and because he had won the fight between all the people who thought they could succeed Nero. And nobody could really buck his power. But the Flavians were just him and his two sons. And he died without having a third son. And both his sons died without having sons. There wasn't really much to disappear after that. There were really only the three of them in the first place.
But a lot of times those reports about their children, because a lot of them have, let's just call it what they say, bastard sons. Or
yes, but unless they were recognized and adopted into the family, that wouldn't have mattered, because the bloodline was far less important than the name.
True.
So unless you came out and said, yes, I am making my illegitimate son my legitimate son, which you could do and which involved legal legwork, and which was considered a very good thing. People who did this were highly respected, but almost no one ever did it. But it was considered a very good thing to do. Just like a lot of things that are considered very good things to do never seem to happen today, too. But I digress. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean,
that in order to be part of the family, you had to be recognized as part of the family.
yeah, you couldn't inherit it without the name.
Did have a very famous relationship with Herod, with the third Herod, no, the fourth Herod. It's so hard to keep the Herod straight. He had a relationship with the sister of Herod Agrippa II, which was a big scandal, and he had to leave her in. He had to leave her in Judea when he became emperor, and it was considered a very big deal that he gave her up to be emperor. Supposedly he really wanted to marry her, but he couldn't because she was married to someone else and having an incestuous relationship with her brother that was a big scandal. And then she started seeing Titus. Now, it's possible they had an illegitimate kid, but that illegitimate kid would have been a Herod and not a Roman.
Yeah, I mean,
Domitian definitely didn't have any kids. And if he did, they would have done the Caligula on them, where they wiped out his whole family, because that's what they did to the emperors they wanted to get rid of.
Yeah, good point. Definitely good point. I mean, but I always wonder though.
Well,
what? Because you got to remember, we're talking about some of the biggest liars in history. I mean, let's just call it what it is. Some of the biggest liars in history. Now, could they have faked their death and pulled a Machiavellian type,
someone would have to prove that. I mean, that's the whole thing, is someone would have to prove that. And if you can't prove that, or even make a good logical case for it, it's not a good bedrock for theory. And it's definitely not a good bedrock for praxis.
Yeah, you're right. I just throw it out there. I got to test it because
I get what you're saying. There are too many real conspiracies to get lost in right-wing grievance mythology. There's an important difference. There's an important difference between real conspiracies, which do happen. Watergate was a conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
The Clinton reaction to Whitewater and the Republican reaction to Whitewater were conspiracies of different sorts.
Mm-hmm.
All of the illegal stuff that happened while George W. Bush was president was conspiracy. That was literally the crime.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the crimes that Trump committed are conspiracy. Now, Trump people like to say left and right, collusion is not a crime. There's no crime called collusion. No, but there's conspiracy before the fact. There's conspiracy after the fact. There's aiding and abetting.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of collusion-related crimes.
Well, that's just being cute with the words.
Yes, exactly. And so when they say collusion isn't a crime, they're just ignoring that conspiracy is a crime when you collude to commit a crime.
Well, I mean, that's what constitutes most of the time conspiracy to commit a crime.
No, when you say when you talk about politicians framing things a different way, it always brings up Joe Biden saying he's going to freeze Social Security, right? And there's still even to this day, there's still an argument about what exactly does that mean when he says that, right? So,
Well, that's a whole
I
lot.
would say, Christy, you want to answer that or me? I mean, I can answer exactly what it means when he says he's going to freeze that. That is what I call a verbal stiff arm. That is just him saying something to push you back for a moment. It has no real relevance. Relevance in thought or statement. It doesn't actually mean anything.
Well, when people say freeze, let's talk about that, because freezing Social Security means not giving people cost of living adjustments.
Which is a cut.
Freezing Social Security means not adding new people to the rolls when they reach the age. I mean, leaving it exactly as it is right now with no changes, except when people die. Now, if everybody on if you freeze Social Security and don't add new people to the rolls or adjust the cost of living, eventually everybody dies and there's no more Social Security. If you keep it freezed long enough.
See, my theory is. Oh, sorry. Okay. No, go ahead, Benny.
I've been getting into an argument recently with people, and I'm just I got people saying, he's going to expand Social Security, and I'm just like, he's got a history of canceling it and saying he's going to freeze it.
So this is where I have found that when people talk about what Joe Biden says he's going to do now, or when they point at something, more importantly, when they point at something in the Joe Biden platform on the website, my question to them is, do you think Joe Biden knows what's on that website?
I said it about what? I said it about his tweets too, because I'm like, do you actually think Joe Biden writes any of those tweets?
That's the whole thing. With the exception of AOC, at least early on in her career, I don't know if she's still doing it now.
Right, I don't think so either.
With the exception of AOC and politicians who are trying to be like AOC, most of these tweets are either being done by their communications staffer or by some intern whose job it is to do the social media stuff.
Right.
If you want to see the proof, look at the disconnect between some of the Bernie Sanders account's tweets and how much we love them versus what Bernie actually says when he's speaking. Some of the really great tweets are not things that Bernie actually says about the people his account tweets about when he has the chance.
Well, it's the same thing as you saw. I guess the biggest stark difference I saw was the Mike Gravel account. What you would hear Mike Gravel say and what you saw come out of his account was, night and day sometimes. Who the hell?
Those kids are great. And Adriel Hampton is great. And Mike Gravel is also great. But yeah, there's a difference between Mike Gravel and the people who were tweeting for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you could literally tell it felt like multiple people tweeting. Because sometimes it would be like, oh, hell yeah, I'm with this. And others I'm like, wait a minute. That's not quite what we should be focusing on here. And it wouldn't mean that it would be something I'm against, but it would be misfocused a lot of times.
Mike Gravel is about direct democracy and stopping war.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Gravel is not a socialist leftist. Mm-hmm. He is a I would call him a political leftist.
Wait, what's the difference, Chris?
So, actually, I would call him an anarchist without necessarily being a leftist. So,
okay.
Mike Gravel is skeptical of hierarchies, which is the definition of anarchy anymore, is a skepticism of hierarchy and a demand that a hierarchy prove its legitimacy rather than just assuming that it's legitimate, under the assumption that most hierarchies are not legitimate.
So my thing is, I consider Mike a far leftist, but it's just different categories.
Well, I mean, he's focused
Bernie,
on ending the empire.
yeah, I look at Bernie as far as the left as a social democrat. I look at Mike Gravel as more of a anarcho socialist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because he cares about a lot of the same social issues. Well, he's probably to the left of Bernie on social issues on a lot of things. But as far as his biggest focus is on the legitimacy of the government and what they're doing, and about, clarification on where the dollars are actually going, and he's more about accountability first and foremost, and stopping the wars. And so I feel like it's just a different where his lane is more foreign policy, and then as
direct
democracy, and then Bernie is more domestic, and through the ballot.
Trouble is that democracy and anti-war do not necessarily go hand in hand. The Mexican War, which is a horrible, horrible crime. We mugged Mexico. I mean, that's the only way you can look at the Mexican War. We mugged Mexico for more than half its territory. Mm-hmm. Was very popular and very democratic. People wanted to go to that war. There was a popular demand for that war. To a lesser degree, there was a popular demand for the War of 1812, and still it started going badly. Mm-hmm. But there was a huge popular demand for the Mexican War, and racism was a lot of it. They thought, we'll easily beat those half-Indian Mexicans.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to remember, racism is almost always behind a lot of this. If you look back to the beginning, the Crusades, you know how they recruited people for the Crusades? They told them God doesn't care about any of your sins.
Well, they basically, when they took a city, they basically killed all the brown people. Now, the brown people were Muslims and Jews and Christians, and supposedly they were there to help the brown Christians. But the Knights couldn't tell the brown people apart. And that's where the phrase "kill them all and let God sort them out" comes from. Kill them all and God will know his own, saying, the Christians will go to heaven, so it's okay if you kill them too.
No thoughts on that, Emmanuel?
No, he's correct. Because I've heard that, even in recent times, I've heard that phrase a lot, and I've always wondered where the origin of that honestly came from. So I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you.
Well, it's a lot of these things that we need to learn that it's like interesting where it comes from. For instance, like the third degree. A lot of people don't know when they say giving a third degree, that comes from Masonic temples. So a lot of the stuff we're inundated with comes from these elite people at the top in sayings they said over and over. They get percolated down through pop culture. I guess we're starting to echo a little bit, and it's getting kind of close in about 30 minutes, an hour and 30. So I guess we'll close it out. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll catch you again tomorrow morning for what I've been thinking with Marcus Gage.
Okay.
You guys have a good one.
Yeah, you too, man. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, you're welcome.
Thanks for joining us. I had a great night. I think this was we have a nice wide-ranging conversation every time and go all over the place. I like that.
Super appreciative.